Okay, you may or may not be required to study the section on completing the square in your intermediate algebra course. That might be saved for the college algebra course, but I'm going to go ahead and briefly talk about it here. In order to complete the square, basically what you're looking for some, I call it a magic number, that has to be added to a quadratic equation that will make it a perfect square. And actually it turns out that that number completes the square. We determine the number that completes the square by dividing the value, the b value, which is the coefficient of the x term, the middle term, by 2, and then we square the result. So I'm going to start you out here. I'm just going to show you how to complete the square for some trinomials. So basically here we have x squared minus 10x, and then I'm going to figure out what number I need to add that makes this a perfect square trinomial. And so what I'm going to do is, you're going to take half of negative 10, so we're going to multiply negative 10 times a half, and then we're going to square the result. Well, negative 10 times a half is negative 5, and negative 5 squared is 25. So basically, if we add 25 to these two terms, then that will make this a perfect square trinomial. And so in other words, it would now factor into x minus 5 quantity squared. Looks like I left the x out right there. Okay, but it factors into x minus 5 quantity squared. Okay, so x squared plus 8x plus what number makes it a perfect square? Well, the b here is 8, so the b there is 8, and then so we take half of 8, so 8 times a half, and then square the result. Well, 8 times a half is 4, so we're going to square 4, and 4 squared is 16. So that means if I add 16 to these two terms, that would now make that a perfect square trinomial, and now it's going to factor into x plus 4 quantity squared. Now, you might have to deal with fractions sometimes. On this one, I have y squared plus 5y plus some number is going to make it a perfect square. Here the b is 5, so if I take half of 5, then that's going to be 5 halves. And I have to square the 5 halves to get the magic number, and the magic number is 25 fourths. So I actually have to add 25 fourths to this, and then this will factor into it'll factor into y plus 5 halves quantity squared. So really these are going to, if you'll notice, these factor into, this one, it factors into x and then plus whatever you squared, so it would be x plus negative 5 quantity squared. And this one factors into x plus 4 squared, since 4 is what we squared to get the magic number. And then this one factors into y plus 5 halves quantity squared, since we squared the 5 halves to get the magic number. Okay, so now I want you to understand, now we're actually going to work with equations. So I have x squared minus 10x minus 11 equals 0. Now, the problem is this minus 11 is not the number that I need for this side to be a perfect square. So what I need to do is I need to move it to the other side. So I move it to the other side, it becomes plus 11. Or you could just say we're adding 11 to both sides. That cancels the negative 11 and gives me plus 11 over here. So now I want to complete this and make this a perfect square. So I'll take half of negative 10, which is negative 5, and square it, and I get 25. Since I just showed you how to do that, I figure you can do it. But if you want to see what I did, again, I just took let's see, negative 10, and then I multiplied it by a half, and then I squared it, and what that gave me was, that gave me negative 5 squared, and that's how I got the 25. So now I add the 25, but since this is an equation, I can't just add it to one side, I have to add it to both sides. So I add it to the left side and I add it to the right side as well. So I have 11 plus 25 here. Now, since this is a perfect square, I need to factor this. Oops. This is, I got a typo in it. So let me fix this for you. Okay, so I had a sign problem here. Since this middle term is minus 10x, this actually factors into x minus 5 quantity squared equals 36. And then so when you apply this, then now we can apply the square root theorem to this, and you get x minus 5 equals plus or minus the square root of 36, and then x minus 5 would equal plus or minus 6, because square root of 36 is 6, and then if you add 5 to both sides, you actually get 5. When you add 5 to both sides, you get 5 plus or minus 6. And that's going to actually, let me change this answer here. This should be negative 1 right there. And then this will be positive 11. So, because 5 plus 6 is 11, so your answer would be 11. And 5 minus 6 would be negative 1. So your answer there would be negative 1. So, you got to be careful on those signs. Okay, let's take a look at this next one over here. On this one, we saw earlier that when you have the 5 for the middle term, the magic number, when you take half of 5, you're going to get a fraction, 5 halves, and then when you square it, you're going to get 25 fourths. But before we do that, we need to get rid of this 4. So let's move the 4 to the other side, and that will give us a negative 4 over here. And now we want to add the magic number here. So let's figure out what that magic number is. And remember, we did this up here. The magic number was actually 5 times a half quantity squared, which is 5 halves quantity squared, which is 25 fourths. So we'll go ahead and add 25 fourths here. So that'll give me y squared plus 5y plus 25 fourths there. And then we'll have minus 4 plus 25 fourths over here, because we have to add 25 fourths to both sides. Now, you have minus 16 fourths because we need a common denominator, so minus 4 is minus 16 fourths. And then plus 25 fourths, that's going to be 9 fourths. And then this, now that we've completed the square, this is actually going to factor into y plus 5 halves quantity squared. So we have, after we simplify the right-hand side here, we get y plus 5 halves quantity squared is equal to 9 fourths. And now we can apply the square root theorem and just write that y plus 5 halves is equal to plus or minus the square root of 9 fourths. And then when we take the square root of 9 fourths, we get the square root of 9 fourths is 3 halves. So we get y plus 5 halves is equal to plus or minus 3 halves. And now we're going to subtract 5 halves from both sides, and we get y equals minus 5 halves plus or minus 3 halves. Now, if I do minus 5 halves plus 3 halves, that's going to give me minus 2 over 2, which is minus 1 for the answer. And then if I do minus 5 halves minus 3 halves, that's going to give me minus 8 over 2, which is negative 4 for the answer. So the answers for that one is y equal negative 1 and y equal negative 4. Now, I want to show you what happens if this coefficient is not 1. So if you look at the previous two problems, the coefficient of the squared term was 1. Well, you're going to have to do something if the coefficient is not 1. And here's what you're going to have to do. Let's say the coefficient of this squared term is 5. Well, the first thing you're going to have to do is you're going to have to divide every term by 5 here, so that when you divide 5x squared by 5, you basically force the coefficient to be 1. So I have to multiply every term in this quadratic equation by 5 so that I'll just get x squared for the first term. Alright, so we know 5x squared divided by 5 is x squared, and then when we take the minus 20x divided by 5, we get minus 4x. And then 5 divided by 5 is 1. So now that I've done that, then I can move on to I want to get rid of this number, so let's move this 1 to the other side, and it becomes negative 1. And now I can figure out what the magic number is to add to both sides to complete the perfect square. So I'm going to take a -4 times a half, and then I'm going to square it. Just square it. So it should be just 1, 2 there. So then square that, and then you get -2 quantity squared, which is 4. And so we're going to add 4 to both sides. So if I add 4 here, I also must add 4 here. And now by adding 4 to this, it now makes it a perfect square trinomial. And I'm going to have x. Dang it, I messed up again, didn't I? Doggone it. Well, all I can do is apologize for that. But now that I see this is x minus, since this is a minus, this should be x minus 2 quantity squared equals 3. And then when I apply the square root property to that, that should be x minus 2 equals plus or minus the square root of 3. And then when I add 2 to both sides, I'll get x equals 2 plus or minus the square root of 3. So your answers are 2 plus square root of 3 and 2 minus square root of 3. Okay, let's see if I get through the next one without making any mistakes. Okay, so 3x squared minus 8x plus 10 equals 0. Here, I have to divide everything by 3 so I can get that to be a x squared. So here I just did this in my head. If you divide this by 3, you get x squared. If you divide this term by 3, you get minus 8x over 3. And if you divide 10 by 3, you get 10 thirds. Now, I need to get this term to the other side, get it out of my way, so I'll move it over here and make it a negative 10 thirds. And now I have to multiply the b term, which is actually here the negative 8 thirds. So I multiply that negative 8 thirds times a half. Well, that's going to be negative 8 over 6, which reduces to negative 4 over 3. And then I have to square it, so negative 4 thirds squared would be 16 ninths. So now I know I'm going to add 16 ninths to both sides. So I'm going to add 16 ninths here, and then I'm also going to add 16 ninths over here. Now that tells me now that I've added the magic number, I know this is a perfect square trinomial, and so it's going to factor into x minus 4 thirds, since minus 4 thirds is what I squared to get the magic number. So it factors into x minus 4 thirds quantity squared. There's a square right there. Okay, now to combine these I need a common denominator, so I'm going to multiply negative 10 thirds by 3 over 3. And if I do that, I get negative 30 over 9. So now I get negative 30 over 9 plus 16 over 9 here, and that's going to be the same as negative 14 over 9 there. Now, what I want to do next is I want to apply the square root theorem to that. So that would give me just x minus 4 thirds by itself equal to plus or minus the square root of negative 14 over 9. Now I can write that as the square root of negative 14 over square root of 9, and the square root of negative 14 would be square root of 14 times I, and the square root of 9 would just be 3. So that would tell me that x minus 4 thirds is equal to plus or minus I times square root of 14 over 3. And then if you add 4 thirds to both sides, you get x equals 4 thirds plus or minus I times the square root of 14 over 3. And again, this answer is a complex number, so if you haven't done problems that involve complex numbers, you could actually skip this one until you actually cover the section on complex numbers. So in the next section, I'm going to talk about the quadratic formula and how to solve quadratic equations using this quadratic formula.